Give a break. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to session number 12 or day 12 of Climate Change AI Virtual Summer School 2024, which is on AI for transportation. First, let me thank all our sponsors, Google, DeepMind, GitHub, CFAR, and Mila, who have been generous in supporting us throughout our program. Just a brief note about Climate Change AI for folks who are joining for the first time. It's a nonprofit that works at the intersection of climate change and machine learning. And if those two topics are of interest to you, I would urge you to go to our website or join our community platform or follow our newsletters to keep yourself updated with recent work that is going on or opportunities that you might have to engage yourselves in our community. Few housekeeping items that's very important to remember is two options that you will be provided is one chat and one Q&A. Please use chat options to make any general comments like introducing yourself or answering some questions or discussing among yourselves. But please restrict yourselves to using Q&A feature if you want to ask a direct question to the speaker about the topic that is being discussed. Having said that, this is a 2-hour session. And we have two speakers whom I'll be introducing shortly. But before that, let me thank my co-TA, Tariq Sehzad, who will be helping me throughout this session. And I am Debashish Mishra, the lead TA for this session. So we have with us today Nikola and Felix. Nikola-Dupont is actually a postdoctoral researcher at MCC, which stands for Mercator Researcher Institute for Global Commons and Climate Change at TU Berlin. His work involves deployment of AI systems for climate action in cities, focusing on narratives, data needs, tool development, and practical deployment considerations. Felix Wagner is a fourth-year PhD candidate at MCC and works under Professor Dr. Felix Kritzik. His work is mostly on causal inference or discovery methods to understand how the built environment of cities affects urban transport. Nikola and Felix, I welcome you and I hand over to you. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Let me share my screen first. All right. I hope you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Yeah, so welcome also from our side to today's lecture on AI for transportation. From my side, also a quick hello. You've heard the introduction already. Maybe Nikola, you also want to say quickly hi into the round, and then we can start.
Yeah, hi everyone. I guess everything was said already about me. Thank you for that. And yeah, we'll be talking a bit later after Felix starts with the first part of the lecture. So see you soon.
Perfect. So yeah, today's lecture, we've split it up in 4 parts. So we want to first give you a general overview about transportation in general. Then Nikola will talk about the role of transportation in global climate change mitigation. I will then follow up and connect machine learning and transportation and climate change mitigation. And then Nikola will finish it off with a pathway to impact analysis. So the learning objectives of this lecture are that before we speak about how to use AI for transportation analysis, we think it's way more important to understand that this transportation always happens in quite a multidimensional context, and all of this needs to be encapsulated in the theory of change. We believe the biggest impact of AI for GHG emission reductions in the transportation sector is via efficiency gains, as well as via initiating mode shifts towards greener, more low carbon modes. Another important objective is that you understand that a successful deployment of AI solutions in the transportation sector always requires a good coordination between the private and the public sector, as well as civic society. And the last thing that is really important to understand is that priorities are quite different out around the world, and solutions need to be context specific. And in many cases, in many places, maybe there are far more impactful solutions than an AI deployment. Throughout the lecture, you will always find some case studies. It will always be the same case, but we have some different questions lined up for you, where you can paste your answers in a Google Sheet. I will explain this in a second. The case will be a kind of real-world case study where your aim is to consult a local government of a city on where to best allocate new bike stands for their bike sharing program. And the questions we have are about suitable metrics and measures for this task. The question 2 is about feature selection for a machine learning model and a selection of a best methodological approach. And finally, a real-world implementation example, including an analysis of the climate impact. Maybe for a bit of a broader context, so usually cities don't have perfect data on cycling demand with a perfect spatial coverage. So what you do is to solve this is you plan to develop a demand forecasting model that, given a specific time and a location, it will return a projected trip demand. And based on this, you can then derive planning advice on where to build new bike stands. This whole case study is completely aligned also with the tutorial you might have seen already. And in this lecture, at certain sections, we will always stop for a bit, talk about the case study. You will get some questions, and then you can, I think Nikola has already or will post a link to a Google Doc in the chat, and there you can put down all your answers. You have 2 to 3 minutes here. Then we will go through your answers and also share our answers. To start off, as I said, we're going to first have a look at the general transportation landscapes on modes, on infrastructure and operators. And to start off in the very beginning, we've brought this quite a good summary from the Transport Geography Journal, which says that the evolution of transportation has always been driven by the need for efficiency, cost reduction, and sustainability, thereby reflecting broader economic and environmental trends. And of course, as those trends continue to develop, further innovations and shifts in transportation modes are expected. In general, we can divide transportation into transportation of goods and transportation of passengers. Some milestones in the transportation of goods are clearly that in the 1960s, containerization has become quite popular, and this has basically facilitated globalization. Nowadays, goods are transported via a combination of modes, via rail, road, air, or sea. And also here, information technology has greatly improved efficiency and the supply chain management of those logistics. On the other side, a key milestone in the transportation of passengers in the last 100 years was that in the 20th century, cars became the dominant mode of transport. And everything, all of our lives have been built around that. All of our cities have been built around the use of cars. What we've also seen is that air travel has grown exponentially. And nowadays, urban areas face congestion and require more investments in, for example, public transport systems, or shifts away from individual private travel. In the next few slides, we brought a couple of examples on how to think about transportation. So one way, for example, to think about transportation of passengers is via splitting it up into public and private transportation. Public transportation, for example, could be via trains, trams, or buses. Usually they are available to everyone, of course, always for a fee. And it's usually also via a shared space, so those vehicles have usually a higher occupancy than private transportation. Private transportation are, for example, via cars, bikes, or scooters, and this happens usually via a privately owned vehicle, and people also have their private space. A different way to think about transportation could be, for example, via green versus non-green transportation. So green transportation could be, for example, bike, train, or electric vehicles. And here the operation of those vehicles does only cause very little or even no emissions. Non-green transportation, on the other hand, are usually modes including, like, for example, cars with combustion engines, or buses with combustion engines, or also trains with combustion engines. And here the operation of the vehicle usually causes emissions and or particle pollution. What is also interesting, especially when looking at urban transportation, is that here not only the emission of greenhouse gases is an issue, but also the use of space, because especially in cities, space is very limited. And you can see here in this example how on the left-hand side, all of those people can fit in just one bus, and you have very limited or very little space occupied, while on the right-hand side, you can see how much space is needed to have all of these people drive around in their individual cars. So this also gives you an intuition about the different aspects you have to deal with when talking about urban transportation. When speaking about urban transportation, it is also really important to talk about urban transportation infrastructure. This is especially important because there's quite some research in this field saying that actually the transportation infrastructure is what shapes travel. So, for example, people not just like to travel by car because they think it's more comfortable, but also, or more dominantly, because our city is built for cars. What accounts, or what is urban transportation infrastructure? This includes, for example, roads such as highways, streets, bike lanes, or bus lanes. It also includes railway infrastructure such as regular or light rail or tram rail, and of course supporting infrastructure such as power lines or shared vehicle docking stations, or also parking places. And what is important to mention here is also that this transportation infrastructure is almost always publicly funded and provided. Another way to think about transportation and transportation operators in especially urban areas is public and private operators, because there's quite some difference here in terms of what their aims are. So public operators are usually not profit, but far more utility driven. They aim to fulfill some policy goals, and they can also operate at a loss. And this, of course, can be way more easily aligned with broader urban policy goals and quality of life. While on the other hand, you have private operators, which of course are profit driven and are only applicable or feasible in profitable routes. But they can also detect demand when no public transport is, for example, available. And then there's a third option, which are public-private partnerships, where you basically have collaborations between public and private providers, such as that the infrastructure is provided publicly, but the services on this infrastructure are run privately. Another concept we quickly want to introduce is the concept of intermodal mobility. So you've probably have seen that the number of modes of travel in cities has steadily increased. At the same time, the traditional car commute has become more and more unattractive in cities due to high congestion. And this has led to the rise of intermodal mobility, where people basically travel in more than just one mode on their route. And a interesting concept that has emerged throughout the last years here is, for example, the concept of mobility as a service, where all modes are kind of combined in one single app on your smartphone, and the routing also considers all available modes when giving you a route. Another concept we want to quickly mention is the concept of public policy for urban mobility, which means that, of course, urban transport policy aims to harmonize different political aims. So, of course, you want to improve economic development, but at the same time, you also want to reduce emissions or also connect marginalized communities. And this basically sums up the large area and multidimensional context in which public policy operates. And finally, we have urban mobility business cases, where you can generally say that urban transportation is quite a difficult market for private businesses, as profit margins can be quite low, as you're always in competition with public transportation operators, who usually or who can operate at a loss. But there are many private operators who found some niches, such as luxury travel or taxi trips, or travel on underserved routes, where they leverage economies of scale. But of course, here again, it's one has to argue whether such niches or such concepts are in the end sustainable and including like low emissions. And this brings us to the end of the first section and to our first break, where we have where we talk about the case study and our first question. Just to remind you again, you are consulting a city on where to build new stations for their bike sharing program. You are building a demand forecasting model that, given a specific time and location, will return a projected demand for cycling trips. And now it would be interesting for us if you could share your intuitions with us. What could be metrics for measuring cycling trip demand? So what could be your outcome variable? How would you construct that? What is a good demand metric here? And maybe you can also share with us what data you can realistically obtain to construct the metrics, and at what spatial and temporal resolution you want to collect your metric. And we now give you around 2 to 3 minutes, and you can post all your ideas in the Google Doc, and then we will quickly go through your answers, and after that share your answers, share our answers with you.
Okay, I see there are still a couple of people editing, let's say, until 24. Can add some more answers. some of this, and then you can still write some few more answers. I see trip frequency, duration, and purpose. So indeed important. We have the level of visualization of bike stations. So these are like some different metrics. We also have some information on what we're looking for in these metrics and how we can collect them. So bike sharing logs, surveys, mobile apps, this is very good. We are indeed interested in the spatial resolution. So understanding in which district neighborhoods, which specific stands are we talking about? Also the temporal resolution. This is quite important. In the spatial data, figuring out where people start and their journey and where they go to and for which reason. This is quite important. Yeah. When do people travel? So also splitting between rush hours, peaks, and like times where there is less of a peak. Link with the infrastructure, temperature, number of bike paths. Yeah, all of these. Oh, and we have a bunch of other and let me maybe share my screen now. I think Felix, you need to unshare first. And I will put the slide with a few answers that Felix can quickly summarize before I get into the second part.
Yes. So I think a lot of the answers have already been addressed by you in the Google Doc. What we thought is what could be quite nice is that an interesting internal data source would be locations where bike sharing stations were searched for in the bike sharing app, because obviously searches are the best indicator for demand. As well as trip origins in the bike sharing app. Then of course there's public data, such as data from open data portals like public taxi trips, public data from public transport operators, or cell phone movement trajectories, or bike sharing data from other cities. And a outcome variable or metric would be that you could, for example, aggregate the origin points of all trips in the bike sharing app within a certain geographic area and within a certain time span. And we've actually done that as well in the tutorial, which you can also, which I think has also been shared already with you. And with that, I would hand over to you, Nikola, for the next section.
Okay, I think I had some issues with my internet connection.
Yeah, but
Can
now
you...
you're back. Yes.
Okay. Okay, perfect. And I think I have some little issue here.
I believe Nikola has to reboot. Let me check if I can share my screen that I can continue? No, I cannot because he still shares. Now I can try to share my screen. Or also in the meantime, we had one open question in the Q&A section about basically what will transport look like in the year 2050, especially for the most vulnerable parts of society, young, old, etc., which are not so technically savvy people. And I think this is quite a good question. I don't have a perfectly clear answer. What I think will be, or what I think is a really, really interesting and useful metric in especially transport in urban areas is a high occupancy. Because at the moment, what we have is a very, very little or limited occupancy. So mostly one person per vehicle, maybe two person per vehicle. And as I mentioned earlier already, that cities have a huge space problem. And at the same time, you have more and more people migrating to urban areas around the globe. I believe one key thing is travel via modes which have a high occupancy. And the second thing is maybe you've heard about the 15-minute city concept, where you basically have all your necessary services and amenities within 10 to 15 minutes of walking time. And this, I think, could also be an interesting concept where basically you plan your cities so that everyone can basically access services within 10 to 15 minutes without the need of high tech or whatever, just by walking, for example. And I think we have Nikola back now.
Yes, I'm really sorry. Can you hear me properly?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Were you just like filling the space, or were you
I was answering
presenting some of the slides?
I was answering the
Oh,
questions. You can continue with
see.
the second part.
Perfect. Okay, so here we are. Here's a slideshow. Can you give me a heads up if everything works? You see the slide, you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Okay, really sorry about this. Those technical problems, they could have showed up like 5 minutes before when Felix was speaking. It literally happened right when I was supposed to talk. That's how it is. Anyway, so yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the role of urban transportation more specifically in the context of global climate change mitigation. So this urban transportation landscape fits in this broader picture. And so we're going to be talking particularly about mitigation here. So obviously, urban transportation has relevant dimensions for climate change adaptation as well. For example, the resilience of transport systems to extreme weather events. But we won't touch too much on this today. We'll focus more on mitigation. So first, I want to give you some general figures and trends on what are the respective contributions of the different modes of transportation and where are the biggest issues. And so I want to emphasize the importance of road transportation because it does represent 70% of the emissions of the sector. And so this is the main thing, although, of course, the other modes are also important. These are the global GHG emissions in the last 30 years. And you can see that there's been a huge growth of road transportation emission. And you can also see that aviation is also quite important. So it's about 11%. And actually, it's a bit more because there's like more warming potential, given to the fact that the CO2 emissions emitted in high altitude are higher. And we also have shipping that's around 11%, but road is still like 7 times more. So this is why you will hear a lot about cars today. Just a quick look at the regional differences to see that trajectories and the ratio can change quite a bit from region to region. And so you can see, for example, the impact of aviation in North America, like it's pretty high compared to the other areas. But overall, the green bars still have the lion's shares. So 2 implications here. The first one is that our current transportation system is way too reliant on cars and trucks. The second is that these vehicles are mostly running on combustion engines that are emitting a lot of CO2 emissions.
Nikola?
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Can you minimize the panel window on right side of your screen because it sort of is
I see.
shadowing. Yeah, it's shadowing all the information. Yeah,
Maybe I
that's perfect.
can also do
Yeah, you can hide that.
this. No. Yeah. Okay. I think
That's fine.
that should be fine. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So yeah, we were talking about current emissions. Now, what about the future of these emissions, and in particular road emissions? And well, it's not looking so good in current scenarios. And as you all know, we do need a steep decrease until 2050 to stay within 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, while what we foresee currently is an increase, essentially because the sector has not yet taken all the necessary measures. And this is what the sector is telling us will solve our climate problems. So automated cars, flying cars, autonomous cars turning into trains in brand new tunnels. But what does the scientific community think about these? What I can say is that it's very limited or uncertain potential is what most of the transport community is giving to all these different solutions. And in particular, something that's important to realize is that a number of these propositions are actually smoke screens to divert public investment into actual high potential solutions, like, for example, train powered by renewable energy, which is what happened a couple of years ago in California with the Hyperloop project. So what is more likely to come up instead of this fantasized image from the previous slide is actually more and more cars. And as you can see on this figure in the top right corner, that shows the number of cars that have been produced in the last 50 years. We have a trend that's really linear. And so this means essentially more and more emissions and more externalities from cars. For example, due to local pollution or congestion. So the bottom line is that I believe one needs to be quite careful with techno-optimism in the space of urban transportation, and in general, not trust Elon Musk. Even though, and this is something we will talk about more, like electric cars, like what Tesla is offering, are actually a very important part of the solution. We'll get back to that. But I want to focus for one more minute on this concept of externalities that is really key, and to highlight that beyond GHG emission, which is one of the main metrics that we're interested in, it's also fairly important to think about sustainability more broadly, as well as fairness. Because transport is an important service and an enabler for everybody's life, and that should be accessible to everyone. So reducing carbon emissions should not mean reducing people's access to transport in general, but acknowledge that transport does involve externalities, which are cost for the society and for people. Fast. I want to drive fast through here. Oh, did I get again some internet issue? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now. We lost you for like 30 seconds.
Okay. I'm really sorry about my connection. So I wanted to give you an example of what I was talking before about externalities and fairness. And I want to give the example again of externalities and fairness consideration linked to car travel. So we have this illustration of this person who's saying, hey, city, I choose to exercise my freedom and reside out in the suburbs. Now I want to drive fast through here without delay. So I demand that public taxis are spent to widen the roads, lower the safety, health, and quality of life. Fair deal? Do you want to check it on, pal? So this essentially, this person claims that the road should be widened, right? And what this is going to likely create is like more congestion, and he also wants to increase speed limits. So let's assume that the person who lives here next to this road actually doesn't have a car, and well, then which they will bear is like increase of public taxes, problem on the safety, on health, and the quality of life, which doesn't seem very fair for this person who doesn't use a car, right? So of course the reality is much more complicated than saying like all cars are bad and unfair, but the bottom line is here to consider like the multiple externalities, for example, linked to a particular infrastructure project, and try to mitigate them. So if I want to use a car, like is it the best? Maybe this is the best for me, but this is also the best for everyone around me in terms of these externalities, and same way also applies to other modes of transportation. So important to consider multiple externalities and search for a fair solution. So now I would like to go back to the basics of how we can actually save energy and emissions in the transportation sector. And there are essentially three main ways to do that: either avoid, shift, or improve. Avoid is essentially about avoiding the need for motorized transportation. For example, via remote work, CCAI Summer School doesn't require that you fly over to physical location, but of course, this cannot be the only solution. Then we also need to shift between modes. So for example, between like the previous picture we showed at the beginning, between 20 car with 1 or 2 occupants to 1 bus. And this not only will require less space on the street, as Felix said, but also requires way less energy to carry around the same number of people. And then finally, we can also improve the efficiency of these vehicles. Yeah. So technology and AI here can help all the three levers that we have here, like avoid, shift, and improve. And this is something we will see later. And so not only we will want to apply AI to these solutions, but what we particularly want is that we can put this different strategy into actions and scale them. And the IPCC proposes here the following plan that's providing useful orientation for this. So it's showing the different scale of adoption, and also the different times to deliver, to, in a way, give some orientation on how to prioritize. So one solution that can be delivered immediately in many countries is, as we said, electric cars. And the IPCC thinks the conditions are met to scale massively the market in the next years, like Norway did, for example, by focusing on charging infrastructure, grid integration, and procurements of EV fleets. At the same time, the IPCC also recommends to focus on reducing and shifting demand, for example, via regulations and infrastructure development, such as high-speed trains. But even if we start now doing these things, this may take in the order of like 10 years to be delivered and start producing effects. And finally comes the quote-unquote hard to decarbonize options that still require a lot of research and development, so also some fundamental research that may deliver more in the timescale of 15 years. But this obviously has more uncertainty. And they represent more of a niche scale compared to other solutions, according to the IPCC. So in summary, we have a lot of solutions, and now it's really about scaling them as fast as possible. And if we manage to do so, this is the potential that the IPCC sees for all these solutions at the global scale. So let's assume we don't take any action for now. And then, so there was a question on like how will be the transportation landscape in 2050. So the IPCC in the baseline scenarios sees around 10 to 11 gigaton of CO2 per year in 2050, which is way more than what we can afford. And the IPCC believes that we can decompose roughly. I mean, this is obviously some relatively rough estimations, right? But that if we scale the different solutions, this is the breakdown that we could have in terms of like the main different approaches that we mentioned. So IPCC believes that social cultural factors could deliver a few gigatons of reductions, for example, via avoid type of solutions. Then infrastructure could also bring a few more, mostly through shift and avoid. And then end-use technologies, where we see a lot of AI, is also forcing to have the highest impact on GHG emissions, for example, with electric vehicles. So then the rest of these, so we still have this remaining gray bar, and this rest should be covered by also supply side measured. So this is about also low carbon electricity and negative emissions. So this previous slide has shown that efficiency and improve solutions have a key role to play. But I really also want to emphasize here that efficiency alone is not enough, and that that we need as much also as avoid options as possible. And this is called sufficiency. This is essentially about retrofitting our usage of the different service to what we actually really need. And here again, I take the example of individual cars, just to see on this illustration the typical day of a car in a city, and it's usually been on average used about 1 hour per day, and the rest of the time it is just taking up space on the street for nothing. And so this also means that if we could share better cars between users, not only we would reduce idle time, but also the number of cars we need to produce, which also involves a lot of emission gains again, if we can reduce this amount. And in fact, actually, some modeling studies estimate that we could be able to fulfill the same level of service with about 10% of our current fleet, which is gigantic change. So here, the technology like AI could help to design services that enable people in cities to have cars more easily and flexibly accessible when and where they need it, without the need of owning a mostly idle car at the larger cost for themselves and for the society. And so this also relates to the point on fairness, that we don't want to flood the world with highly efficient cars, even if it would be replacing all these cars from these previous slides with electric vehicles, because there are still a lot of externalities. So I think what we want is to combine efficiency and sufficiency. So with fewer low carbon, high efficiency cars. However, for these kinds of solutions to achieve their potential, they also need to be adopted by a large number of people. So this is not only the car providers or the policymakers that come up with an idea and this is just going to turn into reality, right? I mean, there are a large number of people who individually make decisions about when, where, and how they travel to work. So when they go on holiday, so and people also, you know, sometimes want to have their own car, or they have their own cultural norm and perspectives about transportation. So it's really important to realize that it's quite difficult to make people change their perceptions about their transportation behaviors and to change their habits, especially when this involves some efforts. And what doesn't help here in this context is that the transition towards climate-friendly mobility is a very contested space. So this is an article from a German newspaper, which is essentially saying, well, look at these cargo bikes that these parents are now all using to bring their kids to school instead of taking their SUV. Look how terribly big they are, and look how much congestions they are creating. So this is the narrative that's being brought by this newspaper. But if we actually look at the evolution of car size in the last century, we can see that there used to be space a while ago for cars and for actually more than these cargo bikes. But there has been such a big increase in the size of the cars that there's actually no more space on this road for the bike. So it's a lot of different, it's not as if there would be some objective reality that's shared by everyone, but there's a lot of different perspectives that are fighting in this space, and that sometimes are also slowing down certain processes. And these different conflicting narratives sees into a quite complex picture of the different factors that contributes to why people choose a mode over another. So I'm not going to go into the details here, but this is a great paper from a colleague of ours that reviewed the evidence on the topic, and that shows that factors such as beliefs, habits, social influence, or cost have really like an impact on whether people want to bring their kids to school using a cargo bike or SUV. And so when thinking about the need of shifting a substantial share of car commuters to other modes, it's really important to think about these different factors and like push for new narratives that will resonate with these different factors for different people. So yeah, this is like one key set of actors, and this is what I want to discuss in my next slides, that can actually have an impact on these narratives and many other dimensions, also including infrastructure and cost, are policymakers. And public policy is very crucial for the transition toward climate-friendly mobility, because it can steer not only marginal changes here and there of like one individual person, for example, but it can really steer systemic changes at the level of a whole city or region or a country, depending on what part of which region is being governed by these policymakers. And so a very interesting example here is the decision by the European Union to ban engine cars from 2035. And so while this is, according to the IPCC scenarios, quite late, actually too late, this is still a strong signal to the industry that they need to transition now. Because soon, actually, if this law remains in place, they won't be able to sell the vehicles anymore. So this is a big risk and a big incentives for them. But actually, this happened a couple of years ago, and throughout the last year, there has been a lot of pushback from the different car lobbying, trying also at the European elections, for example, to get people elected that would roll back this law. But so far, I believe it's still around, and I think this kind of law are really a key instrument. So more generally, the portfolio of potential action the government can take is typically categorized in push and pull measures. So typical push measures are no car or restricted access zones, road pricing, or also speed reductions. And so these kind of push measures, what they try to do is to make it less convenient or less cheap to use a car or a mode of transportation that we don't want. Pull measures are essentially trying to pull people towards public transportation or biking by making them more easy and more pleasant and more convenient. And so what we need essentially is a mix of both in different proportion, depending on the cities and the context. And although these measures can be potentially unpopular and like have political costs, it's important to realize that governments have the agency and also the responsibility to take such measures. I would like to finish this this section with an area actually where cities can do a lot. And this is the question of street space and land use. So how the city is organized in general and how much space goes for each usage. So let's be clear about this, right? I mean, urban development in the last century has been primarily car-oriented development. And this has resulted in sometimes absurd outcomes with streets where almost all the space is dedicated to cars. But this can be changed, as you can see on this picture to the right, made by an AI algorithm a couple of years ago, back when I think the latest one would do much more pretty picture. I should update this slide, I guess. But let's look at these two streets where we actually look at things more systematically. So on the left, we have about 70% of the street that is for cars, 30% for pedestrian, and that's it in terms of usage. And from the traffic, you see that there doesn't seem to be any more space to do anything else. Like all the street is being used, right? Now, if you look on the right, where we have decided to have dedicated lanes for buses and bicycles. So these are pull measures. They attract people with a better infrastructure and services. For example, because now people feel more safe to bike. And we also have less space for cars and for parking, and we have now a lot of space for vegetation and recreational activities. So did these streets lose their capacity to make people move around in the city fast? Actually, not at all. And in fact, this setup to the right, compared to the one to the left, does actually enable twice as much traffic to go about more or less the same speed, because these buses and bikes can carry way more people for a certain amount of space. And this does work in practice. So this is the example of Paris with Rivoli, where access to safe and convenient bike infrastructure has been generating quite big uptake in bike ridership. And so now what's also important to realize is that urban planning, when we are trying to do this kind of measure, it's not only on a small segment like this one part of the city, this one street, but it's really about the organization of the whole city. And so if people can have access to most services they need within about 15 to 30 minutes around their home by biking or walking, then there will be much less of a need for motorized transportation. And this is, for example, what the city of Paris is trying to implement. And this is called like the 15-minute neighborhoods, I believe. So Felix mentioned this quickly previously. And so this is very fascinating to see that the performance of these different urban designs actually are quite different, and where you can essentially see that walkable urban development does outperform transit-oriented and car development in essentially all dimensions. So in terms of GHG emissions, health equity, waste, water consumption, etc. So this is also an assessment from the IPCC. Yeah, so urban transportation is mostly relevant for climate change mitigation, as I said, but also adaptation. Because I didn't mention this topic so much during this part of the presentation, I just want to have a couple of slides to just touch on this. So one relevant use case is that EVs can serve as battery during power outage of extreme weather events. So this is showing the links between a given type of urban transportation and how it can also have an impact for adaptation, right? Because if you would consider that these cars don't have these batteries, then this would not add this additional solution for certain extreme weather cases. And this is something that has been actually deployed in certain islands where there tends to be often these extreme weather events with some amount of success. And then something that's also quite important is the need of like a resilient transportation system, like a transportation infrastructure that's resilient to extreme climate events. As you can see on those two pictures, this is quite self-explanatory, and AI actually may help quite a bit here to identify which are the points where there is the most critical need to make the infrastructure more resilient. So this was quite a long part, so I'm gonna stop it here and just give you a quick recap before we move forward. So the key message is I want to split this key message into two parts. First part is about the framing. So we said that decarbonizing road transportation means less individual cars and phasing out combustion engine as like one of the key things we need. The second a message is that emissions are growing because the sector did not take all the necessary measures so far. And decarbonization is not only a matter of emissions, but it's also about sustainability more broadly, and it's also a fairness problem. Given this framing, some key aspects on how to decarbonize. First, to reduce emission, we can either avoid, shift, or improve. Behavioral and cultural changes are really key, are really underpinning the adoption of these different approaches. We need ambitious public policies that can steer systemic change beyond individual action. And one example of this was how we can use space allocation and design in cities to improve at the same time efficiency and well-being. And I will now give the floor back to Felix for the different use cases. So ML on urban mobility research and practice, so going more into the direction of actually machine learning in this space.
Yes, and while I'm presenting, maybe you can have a look at the Q&As, because there are quite a lot of really, really good questions. I try to address some of them already, but there are many more. All right, I'll share my screen again. So continuing with the connection of machine learning and transportation in urban mobility research and practice. The first big question, of course, is where does ML actually intersect with transportation? And there are quite some areas, and we try to get you a little overview here. So there's clearly an intersection, or like the task of generally reducing transportation activity by, for example, analyzing data, by forecasting activity and demand. There's also the idea of shifting modes, so using ML to understand better consumer choices or to coordinate modes better based on the prediction, for example, of demand. Bike share rebalancing, we've already went a bit into the direction in our case study. A different task is also of course, vehicle efficiency. So using ML to, for example, detecting loading inefficiencies. There's also the topic of alternative fuels. Here, a lot of research and development happens where you can also, of course, use the predictive capabilities of machine learning. And of course, there's a huge topic of electric vehicles, of how to best, for example, predict the charging patterns of electric vehicles, not just for an individual, but also, for example, for a whole city. What would happen if a larger number of people in a city use electric vehicles and want to charge them? How could we best schedule that? Or congestion management, their vehicle-to-grid algorithms. So you can see there are many, many applications, and probably even more than that. What we can also see from the literature is that machine learning applied to urban transportation is a very fast-growing research area. This is an ongoing work from our colleague Josephine. She analyzed a huge number of studies. Nikola was also involved in this paper, and we could find that there's an average annual growth rate of 36% when it comes to ML studies with a focus on transport. And the same goes also into urban form, which is also 55.9%. So you have quite a lot of studies coming up in those areas. This is also what Josephine basically also found, is that ML applied to urban transportation is a research area with quite some high impact. They found quite a number of studies on, for example, shared bikes and scooters and where to allocate them, on traffic management and routing, or on micromobility. What is important to know, and we've mentioned that already in the beginning, that when you look at urban transportation, it's quite a multi and interdisciplinary field. So what feeds into this research? Well, of course, it's transport science, it's complex systems research, it's operations research, information systems research, it's economics, urban analytics, and urban science, material science, as well as geography and many more. So whenever you think about going into the direction of analyzing urban transport, be aware that this might include going into very different research directions and domains and spending quite a lot of time with people from very different domains. And I think this is probably also one reason why Nikola and I like this field so much, because it's so interdisciplinary. From a more practical perspective, what is quite nice is that in the last years, more and more data has been collected in urban areas, and many cities or even regions and even whole countries are making this data publicly available. So you have many cities who provide extensive public data portals. And in addition, you also have, of course, private entities. You have OpenStreetMap, for example, where you can easily download street network data or building data. So there's quite a lot of data coming up. When talking about feature categories, you can see that cities are not only rich in data, but also in data categories, because there are so many different aspects of urban life that can be captured in data. You can have, for example, data about different socio-demographic information, such as what income do people have in different areas of the city, or how's the age distribution or gender distribution. You can have data, economic data, or also environmental data, such as how's the pollution different in one neighborhood to another. Of course, you have mobility data, which can be mobility trajectories, or also just mobility demand. Remote sensing data. Again, there is, for example, some really interesting studies on how many cars park in a city, as well as built environment data, such as roads, buildings, etc. Once you've collected all of this data, there's quite some heavy data processing and engineering involved. So from a practical perspective, again, using ML in the context of urban transport analysis, most of your work will focus on collecting data and processing and engineering this data. Why is that? Because many of the common urban data processing challenges stem from the data's spatial and temporal dimensions. So usually you need to aggregate data spatially or temporally. You need to harmonize data with from different sources and in different formats. And in some cases, you even need to do some clustering to basically find some commonalities across the city. And this is basically, in order to be really successful in processing and analyzing this data, here it's quite important to focus on data practices. So say you need to label your data well, you need to curate it really well, so that you can in the end scale it also well. And of course, it's always important to also have some domain experience in the age of applied ML. So when you only have a computer science background and you want to work on urban transport analysis with machine learning, it's always nice to also discuss all your features and your findings with someone who comes maybe more from an urban planning field. So what is quantitative urban science in the end? You have your applications, you have your data and your methods, and machine learning is basically just a tiny part of the methods section. So what you can see is that ML is not directly the solution, however, it can be part of it. And this brings us to the next case study and the next question of our case study. And here, again, we take 3 to 4 or 5 minutes, where we would like to know from you what could be features to use as predictors of bike sharing demand. Again, just to remind you all, you're consulting a city, and the city want to build new bike stations, and you're consulting them on where to best build those bike stations. So what could be good features to use as predictors? How could you conduct an exploratory data analysis before you build those features? And what are potential forecasting methods to build your model? We will now hop again on the Google Doc, and we'll come back in around 4 minutes.
Okay, so I already see a number of things for the predictors, so maybe I can start here. Weather forecasts and tourism. Indeed, weather as a, so there was actually a question on this in the chat or in the Q&A on the impact of weather on travel behavior by bike, because obviously when you're biking, if the weather is impacting your experience. I think there's quite some research on this actually. Maybe Felix, you have anything in mind?
Yeah, I was actually, did Steffen from our group do some work on that? Because I couldn't find it directly. But if I find it, I will post it later in the chat.
Yeah. Demographics. So previous demand, obviously, can say something about potentially future demand. The spatial distribution is indeed quite important, and also relating it with different other special features, vehicle ownership rates. So thinking about, access to public transportation. So thinking about what are the other modes that are accessible around, in the different routes around where people want to go. There's actually quite some research also that, so going into the multimodal type of transportation, as we discussed previously, that looks, for example, at the interaction between bike usage and subway usage, for example, if like the shared bike infrastructure is located close to subway stations, etc. And maybe Felix, you want to move on directly to our answers?
Yes. Let me go back to the slides. Again, thank you so much for all of your suggestions. Those are really, really good ones. So what we thought as features could definitely be the weather, as you've mentioned already. the time of the day. You can see that also in the tutorial that the demand for bike sharing bikes is quite different throughout different times of the day. Points of interest, of course, how they are basically spread spatially in the city. So for example, where you have airports or where you have lots of cafes and restaurants. Events are also a good feature. You have socio-demographics such as income, as well as additional location data such as cell phone trajectories. What is always important and is an exploratory analysis before you go into the feature engineering. So one way to do this would be to kind of visualize the demand patterns, both spatially as well as at different times of the day, and to try to identify correlations, for example, between the weather conditions and the travel demand. And as I mentioned earlier already, we've done all of this in the tutorial as well. And for methods, yeah, you actually have quite a lot of methods. You can use, of course, depending on your outcome, regression or classification methods. This could be, for example, linear regression or tree-based methods. But you also might want to use methods that scale well to high-dimensional data, can deal with non-linearity, and can account for systematic variation, so spatial and temporal autocorrelation. And here, for example, spatial temporal graph neural nets could be quite interesting, or spatial regression models. However, you also often have the issue that you don't have infinite amount of training data available. And you can see in the tutorial there, we compare a linear regression, a tree-based regression, and a graph neural network. And you can actually see that the tree-based method is actually superior to the graph neural network on the data we use there. And with that, we would move on to sharing some more work from the practice and from the current research side, so that you can see what happens actually in academia at the moment and also in industry. And we brought 2 examples, or I think 3 examples, where you can show what we basically do. The first one is actually my current work that has been going on for the last 2 years, and that's currently being under revision. The work aims to understand causal drivers of urban infrastructure on inner city car travel. So the objective is to basically understand how urban form, so this could be, for example, how dense a neighborhood is built, where the neighborhood is built in relation to the city center, how well the neighborhood has access to a subcenter, etc. How all of those features cause basically car travel. And we compare this across 6 different cities using causal graph discovery and explainable machine learning. How do we do this? Basically, we first try to discover a causal graph with all of our features in our target. I will show you that in a second. And then we use a machine learning model and predict. So we train in 5 cities and generalize to an unseen 6th city, and analyze the prediction using a feature importance analysis, which still considers the kind of causal connection between our variables from the causal graph discovery. And you can see this here on the left side. This is a so-called causal graph, where you have those dots basically mark our features and our target. So the target here is marked with VKT, that's travel distance by car. And the other dots are the features. And you can basically see how those features and the target are connected. And you can also see how different features cause each other as well. And then we consider those interconnections and try to analyze a model that basically predicts travel demand or travel distance in this case. And there we analyze which feature is important at which part in the city, which you can see here on the right. If you have questions to that, we can discuss this later in more detail. Also, after the lecture, you can, of course, get in touch with me if you want to go more in depth here. There's also a preprint of this already on ArchiveX. And And as I said, it's currently not published, but still under revision. You've seen already this. So the work I did goes a lot into the direction of explaining a machine learning model, trying to also go a bit more into the direction of analyzing cause and effects. And this is actually a ongoing topic that is also heavily applied in industry. So you can see, for example, that Uber is also trying to use such causal methods to improve the user experience, as well as to better understand, for example, where demand emerges in a city. And a second example we brought, which we thought is also really, really interesting in terms of spatial planning, urban transport, and spatial land use, is that a paper by Jung et al., which is called Spatial Planning of Urban Communities via Deep Reinforcement Learning, which was published in Nature Computational Science. And here they basically use a deep reinforcement learning approach to plan neighborhoods according to different aims. So for example, to maximize the accessibility of a neighborhood, or to maximize the access to green areas. And I can show you that in a second. So you can see here in the picture on the top left side, you have basically a city with the buildings which are marked in yellow and the street network. You have also some green space, and then you have some non-used free space. And then they use this reinforcement approach to basically fill the space according to different aims. For example, you can see it at the bottom on the right, there you have under B, two different versions, one which is called life circle community. Here, the aim is to fill this vacant land with services, so that this kind of 15-minute concept gets realized. On the right-hand side, the free land is basically filled with green space, so that people have more access to green space. And I think this is a really interesting paper of how one can apply reinforcement learning for urban planning and transport analysis. And this also brings us to kind of emerging trends in the ML section in the ML field with transport applications. We've mentioned already the explainable and causal ML field for improving and scaling experiments. You have graph neural networks or scalable Gaussian processes for modeling spatial and temporal effects in cities at scale. There are constraint focused methods for decision control and planning. And another really interesting field is the multimodal deep learning, where you basically combine, for example, images with spatial data, for example, street networks. And of course, you have large agent-based simulations for digital twins, where you basically simulate, for example, travel behavior in a city. And with that, we come to the last question of our case study. So we've already discussed now relevant metrics for our target. We also analyzed, so how could a good feature for a predictor look like. We also discussed how one could do an exploratory analysis. And now in the last question, we would like to know your intuitions about what could be ways to train and test your model, and how would you interpret your results and structure your recommendations. And with that, we go again into the Google Doc, and we have another 3 to 4 minutes, and then we will come back to our answers.
Let's take maybe 1 more minute until 25. And then maybe in the interest of time, Felix, you wanna directly give our answers, and so that we keep a little bit of time at the end for some questions. Like if so, feel free to if there are questions that you would like us to also answer orally at the end of the session, to already put them in the Q&A. And we will Felix will answer a few more during the last part of my talk now, and then we can answer more after.
Let's do this. So yeah, thank you again for all of your input. I read already a couple of things, and I would quickly share with you our answers. And of course, if you have further questions to that or don't understand anything, feel free to ask us in the end also orally. So how we would approach this is, so for training, we would split, of course, the data into a train and a test set. Here, what is quite relevant to remember is that the data has a spatial and a temporal component. So you might consider splitting the data in a way that spatial temporal correlations are not conflicting this IID assumption. So for example, you could split the data from a spatial perspective, not randomly in the city, but instead train on one half of the city and predict in the other half. For testing, metrics such as the mean absolute error or the root mean square error could be used, or any classification accuracy to evaluate the model performance. And of course, you can also perform cross-validation to ensure robustness. And then from a recommendation perspective, it's, I think, good to identify peak congestion times and high-risk areas. And what could also help to better understand the demand is to analyze the importance of individual features of your model, so you can give more detailed recommendations to the city. And with that, again, thank you for all of your input, and we will move on to the last section. Nikola, I think, will share his screen.
Yes. Let me share my screen again. Here we go. So this is the last bit of this already pretty long lecture today. So I'm going to try to make it relatively short. But I believe this is I mean, this is personally one aspect I find really important in the space of climate change and AI, and in our mission also at Climate Change AI, to really get to think about the pathway to action from one algorithm, one academic paper where we're applying some machine learning tool to some climate problem. From that start, I mean, there are things before, right? But this is a bit like our starting point for like most of the people in this community, to actually having an action on the ground, meaning this algorithm, this AI system is being deployed, is having an impact on the ground and is changing something. So it's like reducing, improving the efficiency of this bus, or it's like making people change modes. And then in the end, some impact can be quantified and that can be seen on the ground. And so there's some action that's been taking, there's some impact that has happened. So I want to go quickly through some aspects that we believe are quite important when it comes to applying AI in the space of urban transportation and aiming climate change mitigation aspects. So a few general meta topics that sum up a bit what we've been discussing before. I think is that the whole landscape in general of urban transportation is changing fundamentally. So when considering wanting to have an impact on this system, one has to think about this different changes. So for example, thinking about the change from individual car ownership as dominant form of transportation towards like a more multimodal, on-demand shared transportation system, customers having like a larger choice, larger opportunities, different service levels, also the different ways things are being funded, etc. So some fundamental changes that are important to have in mind in one's mental model. Then, so we've been talking about a number of these different things, right? Like, where are the different mobility options? So first of all, what's the city baseline? And what are the different mobility options that we can add or that we can modify compared to these baselines? And where are the different aspects that are shaping the system? So the different policies, the land use, the different customers' preferences and behaviors, and then where are different enablers to change this system. So technology is only one of them, right? And there's also the financing, there's also finding business models that actually work. So this is just one mental model, one framework that was proposed by McKinsey. But this is just to highlight also what's important to have like this kind of system perspective. And also to think how this different framework that you could think of can be quite different in the different cities. So in terms of, so here, for example, if we just compare over 2 dimensions like population density, so we have cities with higher density, we have cities where the quality of public transport is better or worse. Improving public transportation, so on and so forth. So really considering also in which city are we talking about generally. So now going away from these meta aspects, I want to focus on certain necessary conditions for successful and impactful the deployment. And so as a kind of like an idea of a checklist of things to try to check to ensure that the problem and the project you are trying to tackle has a realistic pathway to climate impact, meaning, yeah, that we can think of a way to realistically reduce CO2 emissions. And there are so many different aspects to consider, right? So this is a bit of a superficial overview just to give some ideas. So one critical aspect is whether you have the actual data available that you need readily available in the given cities. So cities can be incredibly different in terms of data availability. And this is not only a rural-urban divide as portrayed here, like in a bit of a simplistic way. And so I think it's very important to scope whether the relevant data you want for your application exists in the city where you want to apply your tool, and which stakeholders own the data or manage it. And in the case when the relevant data is not readily available, this may need either a lot of work to create capacity to collect the data, and additionally also some possible ML-based data generation work. Simply, it also means that the project is just not suited for this area at the moment, and that's something one needs to be quite acknowledge this aspect early on in the project. A second aspect that's quite important is the technical challenges that come when working with real-world data, which is something that when sometimes we're working with this very clean machine learning benchmark data sets is something we are not necessarily used to, but these difficult, important problems come with the noise in the data coming from the different sensors in the upstream processes, the potential lack of representativeness from like a limited sample that you may be able to access. For example, I don't know, both of these problems, for example, happen when you get access to GPS traces, and Felix has been working a lot with this, can tell you more if you're interested. Or also the fact that patterns may change with time. So a demand prediction model that's been trained on data from last year may not be valid anymore in the next year if whatever like big change has happened that is not reflected anymore in the data. So these are there are technical solutions for many of these problems, but they do require that one is very careful when building their methodology, and also when drawing implications from the results of a model, in particular, for example, for policy advice. A related point is that interaction with the users that like will often not look like what one can expect ex ante. So it's also quite important to integrate feedback loop in the project and some amount of flexibilities to adapt to the feedback of our users actually using the system. The fourth point is the importance of the relationship with local governance. So as stressed several times today, right? Local governments are really key stakeholders for many of the urban mobility solutions because they are regulators and they're also often funders of the solutions. And so it's important to consider that certain municipalities are more or less open and well equipped to deploy new innovative technologies. And so in some cases, they will be a key ally, but they may also be a pretty difficult partner to work with. So it's an important consideration also when aiming to scale a solution to different cities with different characteristics, different governance, different political standpoints, etc. Next, we talked a lot about moving away from private car ownership and the fact that this is not an idea that everybody likes, and obviously in particular in the huge industry that produces car. So I won't explain this in detail, but this is actually one paper that I would recommend everyone to read. This is by a colleague, Giulio Mattioli and colleagues, and this is in the reading, and this really helps a lot to understand how the automotive industry lobbies for the status quo, and how effective this lobbying is, and how this may affect your new, for example, cargo bike business. Now, 2 points that we did not address today, but require attention. First, the relevance of non-urban transportation, so including rural areas where part of the solutions we discussed today do not apply or are harder to deploy. And the two other smaller elephants in the room, freight and aviation. And so all of these require solutions as soon as possible, and there are also like a lot of relevant use cases for machine learning. So you can also and global trends at the beginning is the potential to decarbonize urban mobility with AI in the global south, while also aiming to provide universal access to basic transportation needs. And so this was in a way a conscious decision from us, because we believe that in a number of cases, machine learning may not be the first entry point there, and that often there's actually, a need for basic infrastructure and capacity building that often seem to be the most important priority. But which also doesn't mean that there's no room, that there's not room for using machine learning. So we can see, for example, how Uber has been using machine learning in Kenya for planning their tuk-tuk service. And so I do leave it to you to determine whether you think this is a positive thing or not, that Uber enters the tuk-tuk market in Kenya. But this is just to show that in some cases, it may be possible to use machine learning to support the deployment of new transportation infrastructure and services in the global north and in the global south, sorry. And so again, transportation systems and different cultures and different situations are very different. So, for example, the share of informal services may be different. So, trying to apply a framework from the global north in such a case, for example, is likely not a great solution. And so, one thing that is very important here is to listen to local problem owners and take the perspective as a starting point, and not trying to apply the solution that works in one cities where one researcher is from, and trying to apply this everywhere. This is likely not going to work, not make sense, and also come with a lot of undesirable consequences. Finally, I want to emphasize again the importance of system thinking. This is my last point, and to embed really your envision solutions into a broader theory of change that links the urban transportation solution that you are considering to the relevant other systems in the city. So this includes also the energy system, the land use, in general, urban development as a whole. So this also in terms of the governance, it may be different multi-level governance context and also people. And so thinking about like having the system perspective from the beginning may mitigate the occurrence of different unexpected adverse side effects and it may mitigate the situation that you realize later, the solution that in its own seems really nice actually does not work well once deployed because it's actually not well adapted to the broader context where it's deployed. So this concludes the content part of today's session. So yeah, people were asking for some literature. There is this reading which I believe has been shared. And we can take a few more minutes to answer remaining questions if you have.
Great. I think that was a great talk by both of you guys. I see that most of the questions were, I mean, almost all the questions were answered in the meantime. But I was going through all the questions, and I think one of the underlying points that came across is about social acceptance. Whatever the path that we take, I think one question that comes to my mind is about the Vietnam question, where people used to cycle more and they have switched to motorbikes. So I was thinking it in the context of what Nikola said about 3 pointers: avoiding, shifting, and improving. Um, in that context, if we think about it, let's say I was currently I am situated in Texas, where everything is far off. You know, it doesn't seem the 15-minute thing can be applied. I used to come from India, so let's say New Delhi, where it's a lot of it's a very populated area and congested area, and compare it to, let's say, Paris, the example that you were mentioning. How do you see if we transition from like these three very different spectrums, do we go for avoiding? Do we go for shifting? Do we go for improving? And how social acceptance plays a role there, if that.
Should I start, Nico?
Yeah, go for it. Actually, my computer froze again in the middle of the question, so I lost a little bit of it, but I would have things to say.
I have, so one thing that you're touching on is like this crazy difference between, for example, Texas, New Delhi, and Paris. And there's actually, and what kind of policy measure is relevant in which city. And this is actually also some work we've been thinking about quite a lot. For context, maybe, so you all probably have heard about the IPCC. We've already presented also some slides from the IPCC, and there's an upcoming special report on cities. And one key topic of this upcoming report is the concept of typologies. So basically trying to cluster cities into similar buckets so that we can basically say, hey, this city is quite similar from a transport perspective, from infrastructure perspective to this city, and there are other cities that are completely different. And I think this clustering can play a great role to decide on whether we should use avoid, shift, or improve. And an interesting thought here is also that we can also cluster not only cities as one thing, but we can also look at the different neighborhoods of a city, and for example, cluster more based on the neighborhoods and see that, hey, maybe some neighborhoods in Berlin are really similar to the neighborhoods in Paris. So maybe what has worked well in Paris could also work well in Berlin. To this social acceptance question, I think this is a far bigger question, bigger issue, especially when dealing with machine learning models where we might not fully understand in the end their output. And there's quite a lot of work going on this kind of explainability part of machine learning. And I think this is always something to keep in mind when working with applying ML in the context of cities. that in the end, you should always kind of keep the citizens in the loop and have basically a feedback loop with them and hear what they have to say about your solutions.
Nikola, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, so indeed, different cities are very different problems. And as I said, I mean, a number of what I've been proposing here, we've been talking about is mostly applicable to the global north cities, cities that are already mature, developed, that have also, where there are already like a number of different modes of transportation that are available, where sometimes modes of transportation are already to, like, in some cases could be retrofitted, right? That you don't like, people are using potentially like not the most efficient ways to transport, like many big cars for transporting few people. And as I said, I don't want to be prescribing anything about the cities where I don't know so well the context, like Delhi, where I've never been, and where I know a few things, but I'm not the expert, right? But my intuition is certainly that yeah, this is definitely not the same kind of solutions that we're looking at there, and where it's really there's probably much less of this need, for example, to reduce unnecessary big cars, or you know, but then what that might be more of a need of adding more infrastructure to help people to efficiently but this is something that we can, to some extent, certain aspects of the
I think we lost Nikola.
Lost Nico again.
Okay, no worries. I think just building upon, because we have another 14 minutes, maybe I can build upon the topic that you touched upon on clustering. So let's say I can see that to be one of the solutions to start with, but then let's say we can cluster them into, you know, 3 broad categories. But then how after that you think AI can help in expediting the solutions? For example, I'm constantly thinking about the case in Texas here, because everything is so far off. So I don't think people will tend to avoid traveling. Rather, they would maybe think about improving technology. For example, switching to you know, other transportation means. But then again, it comes back that here the public transport is not as good as it is, let's say, in European countries or in Southeast Asian countries. So how do you see that? Like, even if you are able to cluster cities into that, has there been a study where it talks about how we can improve? Because it's an entanglement, right? It's like it's the automobile industry is helping in sort of pushing those policies, and the policies also back up industry. So it's like a circle. And where does AI come in to help? Okay, we need a shift here.
Oh, 1 second. I'm sorry. No, I'm back. So what maybe example where you can see the power that machine learning has is so a colleague of us did a study where he used this causal inference methods on where to allocate best people in the future, given the current kind of setting of the urban infrastructure. And this approach is quite powerful because it can be developed in Berlin, and then in a week later, he got similar data from a colleague, which was so the ground data for this whole approach was just mobility surveys. And those mobility surveys were also available in 19 other cities in Europe. And those recommendations he got from Berlin and the whole pipeline, he kind of implemented quite nicely. And it took him like a couple of days to scale the whole analysis to all those 19 cities in Europe, I think it was. And I think this kind of shows the power of those machine learning approaches, that you can easily scale those solutions to quite a number of cities. And yeah, it took him a week basically to then, for example, rank the different cities to see, hey, in some cities actually infrastructure doesn't play such a large role. So basically travel demand is fairly equally spread. And in other cities, you have, for example, very bad public transport connection. And there suddenly you see quite some disparities in the travel emissions of citizens, because all of the citizens at the outskirts had to use their cars and they had to travel individually, while in other cities you had perfect metro connections and there it wasn't such a big difference.
I don't know if my computer will let me answer this, but yeah, to provide a counterpoint to this, so this I think we have pretty nice technical perspective as Felix explained, to compare certain things, to come up with like some finer insights, given that we have a certain data accessibility. And currently often the bottleneck is to get the data accessibility for the different cities. But once that's the case, we have shown that we can come up with some nice insights. But then again, this is just one piece of the puzzle. And if you have these 19 cities, like maybe it takes 1 week to come up with the results that these 19 cities are this and that way comparable, and that maybe we could apply this and this recommendation. But how much time is actually going to take so that in each of these cities, all the different relevant stakeholders get together and also accept this idea. And they should also not accept it directly, right? I mean, they should just guide them towards like thinking, hey, maybe this is where we should look into, and then they should make some more deeper feasibility study and etc. So it's also just to contrast that there are great opportunities. Like it's providing new ways to see new things, but also it's not changing fundamentally the landscape of who is making decisions, how people are making decisions, and like the different power dynamics and all the different entanglements. I mean, this is not something our studies have the powers to change, and these are like bigger societal questions.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, that answer is really great. I have there's one last question, and I think again it is in with reference to what Felix mentioned about clustering, I believe. So the question reads, I want to follow up on the answer Felix just gave. Is there a neighborhood similarity measure that was used or published?
Yeah, I was just checking in the background. We had once some studies, but they were all based on the city level. I can just tell that I did that in the study with my 6 cities, I did that based on the urban form features with, I think, just some k-means clustering, and that's actually fairly straightforward approach. And even that gives you some really interesting results. So we could, for example, see some neighborhoods in Berlin that are just not existent in Los Angeles, or the other way around. You have like Los Angeles is so spread in some cases, and such neighborhood design you just don't have here in Berlin. So yeah, give it a try if you know, like just Google k-means clustering. This is a first approach, but I haven't found anything else that actually is at scale on a neighborhood level.
Yeah, it's a field that's quite niche. I mean, it's niche, it's small, but it's developing, and we have more and more open source tools to play around with more and more data and tools to play around with this thing. So one field to look into is called like urban morphology, and there are a number of people that have been looking into this question for years, and I've been thinking about different metrics. There's more and more research on this, and what we've been doing in our group. So we haven't been trying to cluster to identify neighborhoods per se, but for example, sometimes where we're interested in getting an understanding of a neighborhood or some notion of a neighborhood around the building, we would draw a buffer around a building or a certain area in the city, and we would just compute certain metrics, whichever metrics, you know, some like similarity metrics, diversity metrics of what's in this neighborhood. So in terms of buildings, all the geometry you have in this area. So I had the buildings, the streets, the land use, and then we have shown, for example, that this contains predictive information that's quite useful to, for example, learn about transportation distances, or the difference in temperature in a city, or characteristics of the different buildings that are in this neighborhood. But if you have neighborhoods that are that look a bit the same across different cities in Europe, it tends to be sometimes the same buildings that, I don't know, will have the same height or will have the same age. Of course, it doesn't always work, but there's some kind of, what I want to say is that one can start quite easily to just like play around with the data that's around, and like run a few metrics, and that's an active field where people are trying to think harder. Okay, instead of just drawing a random buffer here and there, like how can we actually understand what's a neighborhood? Because this is something you can do easily in your city when you have the information from the planning department, or the understanding of how the city has developed. But if you want to really run this at scale across the whole continent, for example, then you need to find some automated techniques to define what's a neighborhood. So people are working on this, and this is an interesting field of research. So look, for example, into the field of urban morphology, and you may find like what you need already, or if not, this is coming up.
Great. 5 minutes into the end of the session, if you guys have any go-to messages, feel free to pitch in. Otherwise, we'll end the session here.
Yeah, I feel like we've already given a lot of messages. Maybe this is enough.
Okay. So Nikola and Felix, thank you so much for a great session. And also thanks to Tariq and Eric for helping out at the backdrop. So thank you everyone who joined, and see you in the next one.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye,
Thank
everyone.
you so much. Also, thank you for all your questions. Bye-bye.